Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back. This is Solid Addy, or rather, Naked Addy. Wait, that sounds really wrong, and also not quite accurate. This is Big Boss Addy. Okay, now this is just becoming awkward and cringe. It's me, Addy again, as always, in yet another review of yet another Metal Gear Solid game, as part of our Metal Gear Solid Marathon that we've been streaming over on twitch.tv/Addy again. So up until now, we have completed Metal Gear Solids 1, 2, and 3. The three major releases on the major platforms for the respective times in the late 90s and early 2000s. As a recap, prior to this marathon, the only Metal Gear Solid game I played was the fifth one, that being the Phantom Pain, but now we've completed all three of the first mainline entries. And originally my plan after beating 3 was to go straight into 4. The way I was looking at it was, let me play all the numbered releases because that makes the most sense. Everything else is considered a spin-off. But the amazing Kill Neathano community, big shout out there, as always swooped in with an incredible suggestion, which is to play through Portable Ops and Peace Walker, even though those aren't numbered titles. And if there's one thing I've learned as a result of having played Portable Ops now, which is going to be the focus of today's review, it's that lack of number does not equal non-mainline release. Yes, Portable Ops is a smaller scale PSP game, nowhere near as technically ambitious as the major releases at the time on the major platforms, the PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, but as I understood it, it was still meant to be very important to the narrative continuity of the games. And now that I've played it, even though I do understand that the canonicity of Portable Ops is widely debated, I myself consider it an incredibly important game to play if you want to understand the full picture of the Metal Gear Solid games and gain a deeper appreciation and insight into the narrative continuity. Do not sleep on this game. Definitely go out and play it. So Metal Gear Solid 3, it's a prequel game, right? It goes into the story of Naked Snake, how he became Big Boss. And after that point, you go to Metal Gear Solid 4, which as I understand it, goes all the way back to the future in the year 2014, where both the story of Solid Snake and Big Boss is wrapped up. And then 5 goes back in time yet again to continue more of Big Boss's story. The issue is, having played Metal Gear Solid 5 and knowing what happens in that game, and now having just completed Metal Gear Solid 3, in my head, even though Metal Gear Solid 5 follows the third game, I find it really hard to figure out how certain things that are established at the beginning of 5 came to be without the experience of Portable Ops and Peace Walker, the two PSP games. There are a lot of gaps between Metal Gear Solid 3 and 5 filled in by these two PSP releases that aim to show you how Big Boss at the end of the third game goes from being the jaded, disillusioned war veteran that he is to being the morally corrupt leader of Outer Heaven that perpetuates this cycle of war that he's trying to break. And yeah, now that I've played Portable Ops, having decided to not sleep on the game, I've seen the story that it presents, which is set 6 years after the events of Metal Gear Solid 3, and I can say with a lot of certainty that it's pretty much essential to understanding what happens after that game, preceding the fifth one. There's still a lot of demystifying to do once I play Peace Walker, which is set after Portable Ops, but was released after Metal Gear Solid 4, which is chronologically the last game in the Metal Gear Solid timeline. And once I play that game, I'll have more to say. But this game, for understanding the story, despite the fact that it wasn't directed by Hideo Kojima, and despite the fact that a lot of it is considered non-canon, it's still really important. And more importantly, speaking of importance, it's really fun. Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops is set in 1970, again 6 years after the events of the third game, which was in 64, and it shows Naked Snake, now of course Big Boss, father of Solid Snake, having been betrayed and tossed in jail by a rogue squadron within his former Fox unit, led by a soldier named Gene, who is pretty much the villain of the game. Gene frames Big Boss for stealing, of course, a Metal Gear, and this is yet another Metal Gear game where you play as Big Boss, you escape the jail at the beginning of the story, and work towards amassing an army to stop Gene and clear your name. And there's several cool things about the story in this game. For one, it introduces a lot of familiar faces to the timeline. For example, Roy Campbell, who a lot of you may know as Colonel. That's right, this game introduces you to a young version of the character early on in the timeline of the Metal Gear chronology, and a couple of other really cool familiar faces too, which I'm not going to spoil. And on top of that, this game goes exactly into how Big Boss went on to create Outer Heaven. Gene, the villain of the game, has this idea to create an army called Army's Heaven. It's essentially a military nation for soldiers where they aren't beholden to a government or ideology. And it makes the dynamic between Big Boss and Gene really cool and interesting. It's a lot like Magneto and Shaw's relationship in X-Men, where Magneto hates Shaw's guts. He hates what he did to his mother, but he agrees and respects his mutant supremacy ideology. So similarly here, Big Boss, he hates Gene. Your objective is to take down Gene. Gene is a bad person. And at this point, Big Boss obviously isn't too far gone, but that's the beauty of it. You see the origin of his descent into villainy. And as the story progresses, you see how he empathizes with and understands Gene's philosophy of having a separate rogue nation for soldiers. Metal Gear Solid 3 basically ends on Big Boss's perception towards the original boss's will for a utopia where soldiers are free to be who they want to be. And this game goes into the preliminary building blocks for creating this world that Big Boss thinks is what the original boss wanted. And some really awesome gameplay comes about as a result of that. Throughout Portable Ops, you're basically going through a series of missions where you capture soldiers and put them into different units on your team. And these are those initial soldiers as a part of what would eventually become Outer Heaven for Big Boss. But mechanically, this is a system that a lot of you out there may be familiar with if you played through Metal Gear Solid 5. This was really pleasantly surprising for me, who, like I said, had only played through Metal Gear Solid 5 prior to this marathon, which turns out, in hindsight, evolves a ton of the mechanics set up in Portable Ops. Namely, the go up to X soldier, knock out X soldier, extract X soldier back to your base. Peace Walker, as I understand it, and of course Metal Gear Solid 5, both incorporate the fault and recovery system, whereby you attach a balloon to the unit you're trying to extract back to your base, and it zoots them into the stratosphere where a plane snags him and you see him back at base. Definitely my favorite mechanic in the Metal Gear series, hands down. I think that even by the end of this marathon, even after playing the rest of the games that I haven't yet, Metal Gear Solid 5's fault and recovery system will still be hands down my favorite mechanic across all of these games. But that's neither here nor there. Portable Ops introduces the recovery system, minus the Fultons. In this game, there's such an interesting gameplay loop. It's one of the most inventive things I've seen in the series so far. You basically approach each mission in a series of course, cardboard boxes containing, of course, Snake, who you play as for the most part, in addition to all the other units who you've accrued up until that point. And the really awesome thing is you can actually play as these fellow soldiers. You go up to the enemies, you see him, put a sleep dart in their head, whatever it is you normally do in a Metal Gear game, it's all here. And once they're knocked out cold, you drag their bodies back to a cardboard box that contains one of your allies, and then you use the codec as usual to arrange for an extraction where they're taken back to base. That's how the extracting works in this game. It's really wacky, but really fun. And once they're back at base, just like with Metal Gear Solid 5, you can assign these soldiers to different units / teams to allow them to benefit your organization in different ways. And again, just like with MGS 5, they all have their own individual stats, all ranging from C's to S's. So they could have a, C in spying. So you would put them in the spy unit, which would allow them to gather better intel for you in specific mission areas of the game. But they might have an S in medical. So you'd assign them to the medical unit where they'd more effectively make stuff like med kits for you, rations, so on and so forth. Then you got a tech team as well, where you could assign folks that go and make you ammo for the various weapons you'll discover out in the AO as you go through these missions. It's really, really cool. And again, the icing on the cake here is the fact that you can actually assign these units to your sneaking team, allowing you to actually take control of them. So you don't just play as Snake / Big Boss in this one. And in a really crazy way, that actually gives this game a bit of an edge over Metal Gear Solid 5, which in the grand scheme of things had the most refined version of this system, which is really cool considering these games are 9 years apart. This game came out in 2006, Portable Ops. Metal Gear Solid 5 was a 2015 game. And I emulated this game, and I was really taken back because the PSP was one of my favorite consoles growing up. It's definitely my favorite handheld to this day of all time. I have countless upon countless hours of fond memories gaming on that system growing up. Some of you out there will know that my favorite game of all time is Final Fantasy VII, and that its prequel, Crisis Core, also holds a very special place in my heart. I mean, shit, I got Zack hanging out back there. Crisis Core was a PSP game originally before it got remastered on all systems 2 or 3 years ago. We played that extensively too. It was an awesome remaster. But playing Portable Ops for the very first time kind of made me realize the charm that the PSP had to it. The PSP was a system full of these side project games as part of these popular franchises, in which, despite the hardware limitations of the system, the developers would always try and find really inventive, creative gameplay mechanics and gimmicks that would deviate from the core principles of the main entries on the bigger platforms. So for example, Final Fantasy VII, right, is a major Final Fantasy release. Nice, big, sprawling, open zone video game. Crisis Core obviously was never going to be a big open zone video game. because of the limitations of a handheld device. But despite that, you still got so much depth out of games on the PSP. Despite the lack of open zones in the game, you would still have several missions to go through, small bite-sized missions, bite-sized levels with a ton of replayability and a ton of items and things to find that you would then use to experiment in some really cool ways with the rest of the game's mechanics, allowing for a crap ton of playtime and fun to be had. Portable Ops is pretty much in the same vein. You don't have some long, sprawling, Hollywood budget-esque adventure like the other Metal Gear Solid games, the major releases, but what you do get is a ton of bite-sized missions with a ton of bite-sized things to find that allow for a lot of fun to be had and a lot of replayability, a lot of customization, so on and so forth. I did beat the game, I did roll the credits, but there was still a lot of really cool side ops that I didn't complete in the recurring areas that I would go through. So for example, my intel team would tell me that, hey, you know what, there's a light machine gun in this specific area, the hospital or whatever the area was that I would sneak around. Or there's this special bazooka that you can get if you go to the armory in this area. So even though I'd finished the main objectives in all of these areas, there would still be little things to find, uncover, and do, which I really like. The PSP had that charm to it, right? These games didn't have the biggest budgets in the world, but they were still so fun. And I can see myself just spending hours and hours and hours playing this game growing up if it was a game that I did play back then on the PSP, on top of things like, Crisis Core, Prince of Persia 2 Thrones, and so on and so forth. And this game, just like the other Metal Gear Solids, its staple elements are executed on really, really well. Like having a really colorful, quirky cast of bosses. Despite this game not being directed by Kojima, you still have some really funny, eccentric, chaotic bosses in the game who are fun to fight. And what's really awesome is that, as I understand it, each and every boss fight in this game has a lethal and non-lethal approach for the player. If you approach them with non-lethality, then you have a chance of actually recruiting the bosses as their own playable members as part of Big Boss's squad. I'm of course a freaking noob, so I didn't manage to go that route and I never got these characters, but I heard that you could, from the legendary Kill, as always, in the community, whose favorite game is Portable Ops, by the way. And to me, it's really awesome that there's that extra added layer of content there that allows you to play as the bosses themselves, who you get to recruit as members as part of Big Boss's squad. And one of the other really nice touches to me was the cutscene presentation. You don't have, crazy FMVs in this game and fully animated big budget sequences with the character models in them. Instead, you get these visually striking comic book panels that are beautifully animated. And throughout the game, I thought that the artwork in these panels was by Yoji Shinkawa, my favorite video game artist of all time, and the character designer and concept artist for a ton of Kojima's projects. But it turns out these were done by Ashley Wood, who, as I understand it, did a lot of work for a series of comic books centered around Metal Gear Solid. And that to me is really amazing because his style is pretty much one-to-one with Yoji Shinkawa's. The whole game, I swear, thought that this was art by Yoji himself. But all this is to say is that I loved it. I just think that at the end of the day, the PSP was such an amazing handheld system that developers worked so inventively with. And Portable Ops beautifully exemplified that and served as a really nice callback to why the PSP was and is my favorite handheld console of all time. And despite this smaller scale Metal Gear game, pretty much everything that came before it in terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, the moving around, crouching, proning, aiming, shooting, chokeholding, interrogating, all of that, all this iconic stuff you could do with Snake, changing things in your loadout on the fly, it's all still there in the game. Nothing mechanically was really traded off in this game, it felt like. And if anything, it felt more fluid than ever. I actually would argue that this game feels a little bit better to play than Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater itself, which I was not expecting. I thought that, hey, you know what? It's a PSP game. It's going to feel a little bit clunkier, but that wasn't really the case. And ultimately, I'm just really glad I went through this game. I thoroughly enjoyed the story, and there were moments that I could tell that, okay, what I'm experiencing here is probably going to be retconned later on by the series. But the broad strokes of it, seeing how Big Boss goes from where he is at the end of the third game, how he begins his descent in this one, how Gene serves as a really interesting foil to him, all that stuff was handled brilliantly. And then also seeing where Big Boss gathers the funds to eventually pursue his dream of outer heaven. If you basically want to see Snake Eater Part 2, this is that game. All right, don't lump this up with stuff like Metal Gear Acid and what have you. This is a really important release that I strongly urge you to go through if you are a Metal Gear fan like myself and are also going through the games, be it for the first time or if you're replaying them, what have you. If you haven't played Portable Ops, definitely consider it. If you ask me, it should be a numbered release. And as I understand it, Peace Walker as well, which again was also a PSP release that came out in 2010, that further continues the story after Portable Ops. That, as I understand it, there actually has been confirmation for from the inside that it was supposed to be a numbered release preceding Metal Gear Solid 5. That was originally meant to be Metal Gear Solid 5. That is how crucial Kojima considered that game to the overall Metal Gear franchise and its story. But I guess Konami saw it as, you know, it's a PSP game, smaller release, not everyone's going to play it. And at the time it released, I believe the PSP was already pretty much declining. So they decided to go with Metal Gear Solid, insert subtitle here, Peace Walker. But that is a Kojima directed one. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that game evolves what Portable Ops, the first PSP game, set up, and how Kojima, the mad scientist behind this series, brought his spin to the whole equation concocted by Portable Ops. All in all, it's just been really fun seeing the evolution of these games, both in terms of story and in mechanics, just how the game design progressed. For those of you wondering how to play the game, I ran this on PC using PPSSPP. It is a wonderful PSP emulator. You should have a grand total of 0 problems setting it up and getting it to work. And there are tons of guides out there for how to run this game at 60 FPS, making it look better than it actually did on a PSP, all that kind of stuff. So don't worry. Tons of resources, very easy to get this stuff up and running. And one tip that I can give you that Kill gave me that was an amazing one. Make sure you bind the D-pad on your controller to the right stick. PSP, of course, had no such thing as a right stick, so the controls were, of course, on its D-pad for the camera. And in this day and age, all of us are controlling that good old camera with the right stick. And real quick, speaking of the camera, it's interesting to note that this game on the PSP was the first one to introduce the concept of an over-the-shoulder flexible camera. Yes, we talked about this in the previous review for Metal Gear Solid 3 as well, but that wasn't there when the game originally came out. That was via the subsistence version. So it was just kind of really cool to think about how a PSP game introduced a mechanic that nowadays we all pretty much can't live without, which again, speaks to how awesome the PSP was. Even the games were on the scale of the gigantic Hollywood blockbuster-esque video games coming out on the bigger platforms, this little guy proved that big things can indeed come in small packages. So anyways, Portable Ops, it's a game I highly recommend. Please do check it out if you're a Metal Gear fan and haven't played it already. Very, very, very amazing stuff. I think it'll surprise you very pleasantly. Next up, we're going to have Metal Gear Solid 4 on the menu. I'm not going to go directly into Peace Walker because I'm playing these games in release order. Portable Ops is 2006. Metal Gear Solid 4 was 2008. Peace Walker was 2010. So we're going to go PSP, PS3, PSP again. And fun fact, which I didn't actually know before not very long ago, maybe like 3 or 4 nights ago. Peace Walker originally came out on PSP and got ported to the PS3. I had no idea there was a PS3 version of Peace Walker. I also had no idea there was co-op in that game either. So I might emulate the PS3 version, see how that goes. And I might try some co-op with good old Kill here in the community. But until then, and until the Metal Gear Solid 4 review, it's been real. It's been fun reviewing yet another Metal Gear Solid game on this marathon, and one that I didn't think I'd be playing, but I'm really, really glad I did. All right, if you're doing a Metal Gear Solid marathon, do not skip Peace Walker and Portable Ops just because they don't have numbers, all right? Don't make the mistake that I was about to. Play these games. They're very important. I'll see you guys in the next one, but until then, keep on keeping on.